At 47, the tragedy of Drew Scott isn't a single headline, it's a slow, invisible storm that threatened to swallow the life he built in public view. On camera, he was the buoyant negotiator with a million-watt grin, the twin who could turn a dead-end listing into a dream. Off camera, the noise grew louder. Endless flights stacked call sheets, the pressure of being a brand instead of a person, and the ache of watching a family he loved walk through a health nightmare that sent shockwaves through the fandom. Rumors rose when his appearances dipped. Whispers asked if the brothers had fractured, if burnout had won, if the empire had become too heavy to carry. But the truth is less tabloid and more human. Drew was learning that success has a tax, fame has a clock, and family will always call in a voice louder than television. The years that brought global syndication also brought the quiet costs of sleep, sacrifice routines abandoned, and a private life squeezed by a public schedule. Meanwhile, the Scott family rallied through JD's frightening diagnosis and recovery, a season that forced them to slow down, recalibrate, and decide what mattered most. The audience saw reveals and ratings. What they didn't see was the man counting breaths, between takes carving out time to be a husband, a father, a brother, and facing the question every star eventually meets: who are you when the lights turn down? This is not the glossy sizzle reel. This is the hidden ledger, the childhood hustle, the failed turns, the first break, the empire's expansion, the lawsuits and criticism, the fear, the love, the recalibration, and yes, the moment where everything could have cracked, but didn't, because sometimes tragedy isn't the end of a life. It's the end of an illusion and the start of something truer. Before the empire, before the suits, before HGTV crowned him one of its golden faces, Drew Scott was simply a boy from Vancouver with a twin, a hammer, and a dream stitched together by grit. The Scott brothers, Drew and Jonathan, did not grow up in privilege or luxury. They were raised in a household where imagination was as essential as discipline. Their father, Jim Scott, once a Hollywood stuntman and actor, swapped the lights of Los Angeles for the quiet labor of ranch life in Canada. His stories of near misses, explosions, and movie sets filled their early years with wonder but also with warning. He taught them that fame was fickle, but integrity could survive the fall. Their mother, Joanne, was the steady pulse behind it all. Where Jim brought adventure, Joanne brought order. She made sure her sons didn't just dream, but learned reading, writing, building structure from chaos. She balanced the family's creative streak with academic focus, shaping two boys who would one day build empires from blueprints. It's no coincidence that both Drew and Jonathan became not just hosts, but builders of lives, their own and others. Even as children, they were different. Drew, the more outgoing twin, had a charisma that filled every room. Jonathan was more introspective, a designer in the making, fascinated by spaces and forms. Together, they were a perfect equation, personality and precision. At 7 years old, their father challenged them to earn their own pocket money. So they did what most 7-year-olds wouldn't. They created a product, nylon-wrapped hangers, and started selling door to door. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the beginning of something much bigger. They weren't just selling hangers, they were learning how to build trust, how to handle rejection, how to turn small ideas into real results. Years later, Drew would recall those early moments as the first lessons in entrepreneurship, resilience, and connection. "We didn't know we were building a brand," he once said in an interview. "We just wanted to create something, and that feeling never really went away." That spirit, born in suburban driveways and late-night family talks, would become the beating heart of Property Brothers, a show that turned everyday renovation into global television. But fame has its own architecture. It starts with foundation and passion, and then slowly layers on weight, expectation, pressure, the unending hunger for the next project, the next hit. Drew's climb was steady but steep. He learned early that television was both a gift and a trap, offering visibility while demanding vulnerability. By the time Property Brothers became a phenomenon, airing in more than 150 countries, Drew was no longer just a man in front of a camera. He was a franchise, a symbol of home, of hope, of success, and that ironically left little room for his own. What the world saw was comfort, television laughter, transformation, happy endings. What they didn't see was the sleepless travel, the injuries on set, the negotiations that dragged into dawn, the endless cycle of smile, repeat, rebuild. For Drew, the public image was spotless, but the truth behind that shine was a man stretched thin, caught between ambition and exhaustion, between the dream he'd built and the quiet life he craved. And yet, even under that pressure, Drew Scott never lost sight of his roots, the little boy who learned from his parents that work was sacred and kindness was power. In many ways, his story is not about the rise, but about the refusal to fall apart when the lights grow heavy. Because before the heartbreaks, before the health scares, before the world started asking where he'd gone, Drew Scott was already walking the fine line between creation and collapse. The story of Drew Scott begins not in studios or skyscrapers, but on a stretch of Canadian land where dust and imagination met. Born on April 28, 1978 in Vancouver, Drew and his identical twin Jonathan were the youngest children of Jim and Joanne Scott, a pair of parents who believed in both the poetry of dreams and the discipline of work. From the very beginning, their lives were an intricate choreography between two forces, creativity and structure. Jim Scott, the father figure who would shape much of Drew's worldview, had once lived a life that sounded like a movie script. As a young man, he had stepped into the Hollywood scene, working as an actor and stuntman. He'd rubbed shoulders with the industry's pulse, experienced its glitter, and seen its shadows. Yet, somewhere along the line, he chose a quieter destiny, a ranch in British Columbia, where he traded camera flashes for open skies and the humbling rhythm of daily labor. It was there that Drew and Jonathan grew up surrounded by horses, tools, and stories. Their father's tales of near-death stunts and film sets filled their nights, but his lessons were always grounded. You don't chase fame, Jim would say. You chase purpose. The rest either follows or it doesn't. Joanne, on the other hand, was the anchor of intellect and grace. She ran a household where education was the great equalizer. Books were not just encouraged, they were mandatory. She taught her children that success without wisdom was fleeting and that character was worth far more than applause. From her, Drew learned patience, precision, and the quiet strength that would later define his calm on screen. The twins were inseparable but not identical in spirit. Drew was the dreamer, quick with charm, always scheming about what could be. Jonathan was the builder, the one who turned ideas into blueprints. Together, they were like the two halves of a single mind, vision and execution, sparkle and substance. Their childhood wasn't lavish. The family wasn't wealthy, but what they lacked in money, they made up for in imagination. When other kids were spending weekends on video games, Drew and Jonathan were inventing small projects, building forts, or selling homemade crafts. One day, when the twins were just 7, their father gave them a simple challenge. If you want something, earn it. Most children might have shrugged it off. The Scotts didn't. They crafted nylon-covered hangers by hand, tiny loops of fabric and wire, and started selling them door to door. It was their first business, their first test of perseverance. They knocked on strangers' doors, smiled through rejections, and celebrated every sale as if it were a treasure. And then came their first big break. A woman in the neighborhood ordered hangers in bulk. For most kids, that meant extra toys. For the Scotts, it meant a revelation effort could turn into independence. It was the moment that etched into Drew's young heart the belief that hard work and persistence could create worlds. Years later, Drew would say, that sale wasn't about hangers. It was about realizing we could make something from nothing. But life in the Scott household wasn't all business. There was also laughter, chaos, and competition. The twins shared everything: birthdays, friends, ambitions, but they also pushed each other to be better. Drew's athletic streak led him to basketball, where his tall frame and competitive fire gave him dreams of going pro. He practiced for hours sometimes, until his hands blistered, chasing a future that seemed within reach. Then came the first heartbreak of his life, not a romantic one, but the kind that shatters youthful certainty. Injuries ended his basketball aspirations. The dream evaporated almost overnight, and Drew found himself adrift. For a while, the loss left him quiet, subdued, but out of that silence grew a new obsession: performance. With his father's past in the film industry, acting had always hovered around the edges of their lives. Now Drew stepped toward it. He began auditioning for small roles, appearing in shows like Smallville and Breaker High. They weren't lead roles, barely cameos, but they gave him something irreplaceable, a taste of the camera, of storytelling, of what it meant to connect with an audience. During those early years, he also learned about rejection, the kind that doesn't just bruise, but carves humility into the ego. Casting directors often passed him over. Opportunities slipped through fingers, no matter how hard he tried to hold on. Yet every setback only reinforced a truth that had been forged in childhood: success is not an event, but endurance. Meanwhile, Jonathan found his rhythm in design and construction. He was the grounded half of their partnership, sketching, measuring, building. Drew admired his brother's precision, even as he chased acting auditions, and together they began dabbling in real estate, first small, then ambitious. By the time the twins reached university, they had already flipped their first property, transforming a neglected student house into a cozy rental. It was risky, exhausting, and exhilarating. The profit they made wasn't just financial, it was philosophical. They had learned to see potential where others saw decay. That mindset would become their superpower. Every great story has a foreshadowing, the quiet hint of what's to come. For Drew Scott, it was this: a child raised between ranch life and imagination, taught by a stuntman to take risks and a teacher to think deeply, shaped by early loss and early hustle. No one watching those two boys selling hangers in the cold Vancouver air could have guessed that one day they'd sell a dream to millions, the dream of home, of family, of belonging. And yet, even as their journey began its rise, a shadow was forming: the price of ambition, the toll of constant motion, and the kind of tragedy that doesn't come with an explosion, but with a whisper. By the time Drew and Jonathan Scott entered their university years at the University of Calgary, their drive had already set them apart. Most students were chasing grades or weekend plans. The Scotts were chasing potential, real estate potential. While their peers worried about tuition, the twins were studying property values, market fluctuations, and renovation costs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was electric. They weren't just trying to survive college, they were trying to build a foundation for the future. It began with one forgotten property near campus, a rundown house most people would have dismissed as a financial nightmare. But Drew and Jonathan didn't see cracked paint or broken floors. They saw a blank canvas. They borrowed money, took the leap, and spent months repairing it by hand. They painted, replaced flooring, scrubbed walls, and learned the unromantic truth of construction: that sweat was the only currency that mattered. When they finally rented it out to fellow students, it wasn't just profit. It was proof that vision and discipline could turn ruin into reward. That first success ignited a hunger. One house became two, two became four. They studied every deal like an anatomy lesson: what worked, what failed, what they could do faster or smarter. Jonathan's natural aptitude for design blended seamlessly with Drew's gift for negotiation. The brothers became an unstoppable pair. Jonathan built the dream and Drew sold it. Soon their reputation spread. Around campus, people whispered about the twins who flipped houses before graduation. It sounded impossible, but they were doing it one hammer strike at a time. Still, Drew's heart wasn't entirely in brick and mortar. Somewhere in between renovations and paperwork, the glow of Hollywood kept calling. Acting had been his first love, the one dream that had survived every other collapse. He had already appeared in small roles during his teenage years, and the thrill of being on set never left him. Even when he was sealing deals, his mind wandered to storyboards, cameras, and scripts. He wanted to build homes, yes, but he also wanted to tell stories. In 2006, he made the kind of decision that defines a lifetime. He left the comfort of Calgary and moved to Vancouver alone to chase acting full-time. Jonathan stayed behind to run their business, ensuring the empire they'd built didn't crumble. For Drew, it was a leap into uncertainty, a choice that would test both his ambition and his resilience. The entertainment world, as he quickly discovered, was far less kind than real estate. He faced endless auditions, rejection letters, and the brutal instability of freelance life. There were days when he didn't know how he'd pay rent. The money he'd earned from flipping homes began to vanish. For the first time, he was drowning. Yet even in that chaos, he refused to quit. He found odd jobs, rekindled his real estate license, and built a small business in Vancouver to stay afloat. He worked long hours during the day and studied scripts at night, sleeping in fragments between the two worlds he was trying to merge. But in the background, something else was taking shape. Alongside Jonathan and their older brother JD, Drew founded a small production company called Davidian Productions. It was a modest start, independent films, corporate videos, and passion projects, but it hinted at a larger destiny, blending real estate with storytelling. The brothers were unknowingly building the skeleton of what would later become their media empire. In the following years, Drew's persistence began to pay off. He landed several small television roles, gaining confidence and a deeper understanding of how production worked from the inside. He learned to appreciate every department, the lighting, the editing, the subtle choreography between camera and host. But what truly captivated him was the relationship between authenticity and performance. The best stories, he once said, aren't acted, they're lived. That philosophy would become the essence of Property Brothers. By 2009, television was hungry for a new kind of reality series, one that mixed real estate with emotion, expertise with heart. Drew and Jonathan pitched a few ideas, but none quite landed until Cineflix Productions came knocking. They were developing a show tentatively called My Dream Home, a concept that followed families buying and renovating their perfect space. The producers wanted someone who could bridge charm with business sense and on-camera presence, who could make complicated decisions feel relatable. Drew was an obvious fit. At first, the idea was for Drew to co-host with a designer, but something felt off. When he suggested bringing in Jonathan, his twin, who had spent years mastering construction, the puzzle suddenly clicked. It wasn't just two hosts, it was a narrative of brotherhood, a natural rhythm, two halves of one promise. And just like that, Property Brothers was born. When the first episode aired in 2011, few could have predicted what was coming. The format was deceptively simple. Drew helped families navigate the messy maze of budgets and real estate deals, while Jonathan transformed broken homes into dream spaces. But it was the chemistry, the teasing, the warmth, the genuine care that captured hearts. The show wasn't about houses, it was about hope. It was about believing that transformation was possible, not just for walls, but for lives. Within months, the Scotts became household names. Property Brothers exploded across borders, airing in over 150 countries and turning the twins into HGTV royalty. They were charismatic, humble, and relatable heroes for an era obsessed with reinvention. But what fame gives quickly, it also begins to demand back. The show's success turned into a marathon of filming schedules, press tours, and endless expansion. Drew became the face of an empire, book deals, spin-offs, endorsements, and though he wore the role well, something beneath the surface began to shift. Behind the charm was fatigue. Behind the smile, the slow erosion of privacy. The man who once dreamed of acting had found his spotlight, but not the peace he thought would come with it. And in the years ahead, that imbalance between visibility and vulnerability would lead him into the most fragile chapter of his story. Because when your entire identity is built on transformation, you can't help but wonder what happens when the one who builds everyone else's dreams starts to lose his own. By the mid-2010s, Drew and Jonathan Scott were no longer television hosts. They were a brand, a movement, a global comfort phenomenon. Property Brothers had evolved from a humble Canadian concept into an international juggernaut, syndicated in over 150 countries and subtitled in dozens of languages. Audiences everywhere recognized their synchronized rhythm. Drew, the sharp-suited negotiator with a smile that could sell optimism itself, and Jonathan, the laid-back craftsman who could turn drywall into dreams. It wasn't just television anymore, it was emotion on demand. The Scotts didn't sell houses, they sold hope in 42-minute episodes. Viewers saw families walk through crumbling ruins and emerge with teary-eyed joy in pristine living rooms. And through it all, Drew stood as the architect of reassurance, calm, confident, unwavering. Hollywood took notice. Talk shows courted them, magazines plastered their faces across glossy covers, and brands fought for their endorsement. Drew appeared on Good Morning America, The Ellen DeGeneres Show, and Today, charming hosts and audiences alike with that effortless wit. HGTV, once a niche network for weekend hobbyists, had found its poster children. The Scott effect was measurable each time they launched a new series. Ratings surged, sponsors multiplied, and rival networks scrambled to imitate their formula. Their empire expanded fast, brother versus brother, where sibling rivalry met demolition derby. Property Brothers Forever Home, a more emotional version that made fans cry as often as they smiled. Celebrity IOU, where Drew and Jonathan joined Hollywood A-listers, Brad Pitt, Viola Davis, Michael Bublé, to renovate homes for the unsung heroes in their lives. These shows blurred the line between craftsmanship and catharsis. Every reveal was part construction, part therapy session, ending with hugs, tears, and a reminder that beauty could be built even from brokenness. Behind the camera, their production company, Scott Brothers Entertainment, grew into a media powerhouse, producing not only home renovation series, but also lifestyle documentaries and scripted content. The twins wrote best-selling books on design and success. They released a country pop single, Hold On, that unexpectedly charted in the top 40. Drew even joined Dancing with the Stars, charming audiences with his surprising grace and self-deprecating humor. The world couldn't get enough. But no one can run at that velocity forever. As seasons piled up, so did the toll. Each show required grueling hours, travel across continents, constant filming under hot lights, and impossible timelines. What looked seamless on screen was often chaos behind it. Construction delays, last-minute redesigns, endless reshoots. Drew became both the face and the fulcrum of a massive production schedule that rarely slept. Sleep itself became a luxury. By 2019, the pressure began to show. Fans noticed subtle changes. Drew looked thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. Rumors swirled. Was he sick, burned out, leaving the show? He smiled through the speculation, assuring audiences he was fine, but those close to him knew better. Years of relentless work combined with constant public scrutiny were wearing him down. Then came the headlines. During production that year, homeowners from a Property Brothers spinoff filed a lawsuit alleging poor workmanship by contractors. Although the brothers weren't personally responsible for the build quality, their names were everywhere. For the first time, their pristine image was dragged through controversy. Drew responded with calm professionalism, defending the integrity of their brand, but privately, it hurt. He had built his reputation on trust and transformation, and now strangers were questioning both. The show's massive success also came with a stranger consequence: isolation. Fame, for all its lights, can be incredibly lonely. Drew's days were scheduled down to the minute: calls, shoots, appearances, meetings. Privacy became a myth. He once joked, "I'm in more people's homes than their actual relatives." It was true and tragic. Yet even in the exhaustion, Drew kept building, because that's what he knew how to do. He poured himself into work, into the joy of creating, into the comfort of helping others find theirs. But when his older brother J.D. Scott suddenly fell ill with a mysterious and debilitating condition that left him bedridden. Something inside Drew shifted. The glitz of HGTV dimmed overnight. The family gathered around JD, unsure whether he would recover. The experience cracked open a truth that Drew had long ignored. Success means nothing when family is fragile. For months, as JD fought for his health, Drew kept filming. He smiled through interviews, hosted charity events, attended premieres, all while privately confronting fear and exhaustion. Fame demanded that he stay on. Humanity demanded that he stop. The conflict nearly broke him. When JD finally received a diagnosis and began to heal, Drew stepped back, reassessing everything. For the first time in his career, he prioritized rest. He spoke publicly about balance, burnout, and the unseen costs of overachievement. "I used to think happiness meant building more," he admitted in a 2021 interview. "Now, I know it means building less, but better." The fan response was profound. People saw in Drew not just a TV personality, but a man who had touched the edge of collapse and returned with wisdom. His vulnerability made him more beloved than ever. Property Brothers continued stronger than before, but its tone subtly changed. Episodes became less about glossy perfection and more about empathy, gratitude, and family connection. Ironically, it was this softening the cracks in the perfection that made Drew's star shine even brighter. The world didn't want another untouchable celebrity. It wanted a human being who stumbled, recalibrated, and kept creating anyway. As the 2020s unfolded, the Scott brothers' empire stabilized into something more sustainable. Their company invested in eco-friendly renovations and affordable housing projects. They became advocates for green construction and mental health awareness within the entertainment industry. And while Drew never abandoned television, he began to build something even rarer in Hollywood peace, the kind that doesn't trend but endures. Yet even as he found balance, another story was quietly taking shape, one not about fame or fortune, but about love, fatherhood, and rediscovery. Because the next act of Drew Scott's life wasn't written in contracts or blueprints, it was written in heartbeats. Fame, for all its brightness, has a strange way of casting shadows, and for Drew Scott, those shadows began to grow long and heavy around the same time the world thought he'd reached his peak. To the outside eye, his life was an architectural masterpiece. Thriving shows, a loving wife, adoring fans, global recognition. Yet behind the scenes, the man who helped millions build their dream homes was quietly struggling to hold up the walls of his own. The downfall didn't come as a crash. It came as a slow, invisible crumble, the kind of erosion that happens when exhaustion wears through even the strongest foundation. In interviews, Drew would smile, his voice warm, his jokes sharp, but those who knew him best noticed something different. The pauses between sentences, the flicker of fatigue in his eyes, the way he carried the weight of every unfinished episode, every crew he felt responsible for, every promise made under contract. The relentless schedule was the first thief. Filming Property Brothers, Celebrity, IOU, Forever Home, and Brother versus Brother often meant months away from home, different time zones every week, 16-hour days, under studio lights, and constant pressure to perform. The public saw charisma and ease. What they didn't see were the days when Drew could barely keep his eyes open during voiceovers, or the nights when he'd call Linda just to hear her voice before falling asleep mid-conversation. Then came the whispers, rumors that he was pulling away from the show, that the brothers were feuding, that burnout had finally caught up with him. Drew ignored them at first. The best way to silence gossip, he believed, was through work, but the truth had a way of forcing its way out. As the years piled on, so did the strain. Between travel deadlines and endless renovation schedules, Drew's body began to revolt. He experienced crushing fatigue headaches and a gnawing anxiety that followed him even off camera. The irony was painful. The man who told others how to rebuild had no idea how to fix himself. And then, as if fate wanted to turn the pressure dial higher, tragedy struck close to home. His older brother, J.D. Scott, suddenly fell ill in 2019 with a mysterious, debilitating condition. For months, doctors couldn't explain why J.D. was bedridden, why his body seemed to be shutting down. The diagnosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, aggravated by mercury poisoning, came late and left scars even after recovery. Drew was shattered, watching his brother, a man once full of vitality, fade under hospital lights, broke something inside him. He later confessed, "You think you're prepared for anything until someone you love gets sick. Then all your success feels meaningless." While the cameras kept rolling, Drew was fighting silent battles on two fronts: grief and guilt. He couldn't stop production. Hundreds of people depended on him, but he couldn't focus either. The smiling host became a man running on autopilot, haunted by questions about purpose, family, and mortality. Online fans noticed his absence in several episodes. Some wondered if he was taking a break. Others speculated he was quitting. Few realized the truth: he was standing beside his brother's hospital bed, holding his hand, promising him they'd both get through it. In those months, something shifted profoundly in Drew's outlook. The man who had once measured his life in ratings and contracts began to see the fragility of time. He had spent decades helping strangers find their dream homes, but he hadn't spent nearly enough time in his own. The empire he'd built, HGTV, the production company, the books, the fame, suddenly looked less like success and more like a maze he'd forgotten how to escape. When JD began to recover, Drew realized it wasn't enough to keep surviving. He needed to rebuild, this time from the inside out. He stepped away quietly from several projects, scaling back his schedule, delegating leadership at Scott Brothers Entertainment, and rediscovering what peace actually looked like. For months, he vanished from television's constant spotlight. Fans speculated endlessly. Tabloids spun tales of burnout, secret illness, even tension with Jonathan. But the truth was simpler and far more human. Drew Scott was healing. In his rare public appearances during that time, Drew began speaking openly about the hidden toll of fame. "People see the edited version," he said in one interview. "They see the smile, the reveal, the happy ending. They don't see the nights when you question why you're doing it. They don't see how hard it is to be everyone's version of perfect." He became an advocate for mental health within the industry, emphasizing rest, balance, and authenticity. The man once defined by ambition now spoke about slowing down. "You can build 1,000 houses," he said softly, "but if you lose yourself, none of them will ever feel like home." Still, Hollywood has a short memory, and absence is often mistaken for irrelevance. Rumors grew, crueler claims that he'd lost his spark, that his empire was fading. Drew refused to answer them. He didn't need to. The truth was living proof. The brothers' shows continued to thrive, their fans stayed loyal, and their family bonds were stronger than ever. Yet even after healing physically and emotionally, Drew carried with him an invisible scar, a quiet melancholy that came from realizing how fragile even the strongest foundations could be. In that fragility, however, was beauty. He'd seen both sides of success, now the applause and the silence that follows it. And perhaps in that balance, he had finally found the thing he'd been building toward all along: contentment. When Drew eventually returned to television full-time, his presence felt different. The humor was still there, but so was a deeper calm, a humility that came from loss and perspective. He wasn't just building houses anymore, he was building meaning. In the end, his tragedy wasn't a fall from grace, it was an awakening. The collapse wasn't of career or reputation, but of illusion. He had learned what every dreamer eventually must, that fame doesn't protect you from life's blows. It only amplifies the sound when they land. But perhaps the most haunting part of Drew Scott's story is this: how close he came to walking away entirely. For months, he debated quitting television for good, disappearing into a quiet life of family travel and stillness. He didn't, but those thoughts left a mark, a whisper that lingers still in the background of every episode, every smile. because even now, beneath the polished surface, there's a man who once looked at the empire he built and wondered if he'd lost himself in its walls. And that perhaps is the true mystery, not how Drew Scott rose to fame, but how he nearly vanished inside it. When Drew Scott finally slowed down, the silence was strange. After years of airports, cameras, and deadlines, he found himself listening to the stillness, hearing perhaps for the first time the hum of a life he'd never truly paused to live. The fame hadn't disappeared, it had just softened around the edges, becoming something quieter, more sustainable. And, in that quiet, something beautiful began to grow. He had always been the builder, the fixer, the one who could turn chaos into structure. But for once, Drew wasn't rebuilding for others, he was rebuilding for himself. He took long breaks between filming schedules. He spent mornings walking instead of rushing to meetings. He learned to say no, a word that once terrified him. For years, he admitted in a podcast, "I thought slowing down meant losing momentum. Now I know it means regaining myself." Amid that shift came a chapter that transformed everything love. In 2010, while attending a Toronto Fashion Week event in Los Angeles, he met Linda Fan. She wasn't a celebrity or a designer chasing fame. She was an architect of ideas working behind the scenes at the Scott Brothers Company. Their connection was immediate but grounded. She wasn't impressed by TV, Drew recalled. She cared about who I was off camera, and that was new for me. Their relationship grew quietly over 8 years, built not on spectacle, but shared values, creativity, balance, curiosity, and compassion. In 2018, they married in a sun-soaked Italian ceremony, surrounded by friends, family, and rolling vineyards, a fairy tale not staged for the cameras, but lived in full sincerity. The ceremony was featured in the TLC special, Drew and Linda Say I Do, giving fans a glimpse of something real, not Hollywood glamour, but genuine intimacy. Marriage didn't slow Drew's ambition, it redefined it. He began to see success not as accumulation, but as alignment. He and Linda moved into a home they designed together in Los Angeles, a serene, minimal space filled with light music and laughter. Their evenings weren't spent discussing ratings or renovations, but art, travel, and the future. They shared a vision that was as much about the world as it was about themselves, projects rooted in sustainability, mental health awareness, and giving back. Then in 2022 came the moment that changed his rhythm forever: fatherhood. Their son Parker James Scott arrived quietly without fanfare, yet instantly became the center of Drew's universe. When I held him for the first time, Drew said it was like everything I'd ever built finally made sense. Parenthood gave his life a new blueprint, one not measured in episodes or income, but in first words, late-night giggles, and small, perfect silences. On social media, Drew began sharing glimpses of that new world, snapshots of family breakfasts, road trips, and little Parker clutching a tiny hammer with his father's grin. Fans saw the same Drew they'd always loved, but now anchored by a deeper, quieter happiness. It wasn't about proving anymore, it was about being. Professionally, he and Jonathan continued to evolve. Their company expanded into Scott Brothers Global, with ventures in design publishing and media production. In 2024, they prepared to launch new shows backed by the Bros and Don't Hate Your House, each project a reflection of their growth, less about transformation for spectacle, more about connection, empathy, and sustainability. Drew also became a vocal advocate for green building practices, insisting that renovation should never come at the planet's expense. He pushed for recyclable materials, energy-efficient systems, and designs that honored both beauty and responsibility. In interviews, he often tied these ideas back to his own evolution. You learn to build differently when you've learned to live differently. Today, Drew Scott stands in a rare position, an entertainer who found peace without stepping away from the spotlight. His empire didn't collapse, it matured. His fame didn't fade, it softened. And the boy who once sold nylon hangers door to door now teaches millions that true success isn't in what you own, it's in what you create and protect. Still, if you listen closely when he speaks, you can hear the echo of everything he's lived through, the rise, the collapse, the quiet rediscovery. There's humility in his laughter now, depth behind his smile. He's still the man who can sell a dream, but the dream has changed. Because for Drew Scott, the greatest renovation wasn't one seen on television. It was the one that rebuilt his own heart. When the dust settles on the bright lights of television and the noise of celebrity fades, what remains of Drew Scott's story is something deeply human, a reminder that the most enduring legacies are not built from fame, but from meaning. Few television figures have blended practicality and empathy the way Drew has. His legacy doesn't live in one show or even in the empire he built with Jonathan. It lives in what he represents, the belief that creation in its truest form can heal. Property Brothers changed television in ways few expected. Before, the Scotts' home renovation shows were transactional about profit budgets, blueprints. Drew and Jonathan made it emotional. They turned drywall and paint into storytelling tools. Each episode became a short film about hope, a couple outgrowing their past, a family reclaiming stability, a dream reborn in wood and glass. Viewers didn't just watch renovations, they watched resilience. Drew's gift wasn't only his charisma, it was his ability to make people feel seen in the process of rebuilding. He wasn't the glossy host with perfect hair, he was the voice that said, "You can start over too." In doing so, he helped millions reimagine not just their homes, but their lives. Even critics who once dismissed reality TV as shallow were forced to admit that the Scotts had created something different, empathy disguised as entertainment. Culturally, Drew and Jonathan became more than personalities. They became symbols of a new kind of masculinity in media. They weren't the aloof, unapproachable stars of Hollywood's golden age. They were approachable, self-deprecating kind. They showed that strength could coexist with sensitivity and that success didn't require arrogance. In interviews, Drew often rejected the idea of celebrity perfection. He said, "I'd rather people see the work, not the image." That philosophy resonated in an age obsessed with filters and facades. Younger viewers began citing him as an example of authenticity in an industry built on illusion. Then there's his influence off-screen. Drew and Jonathan's production company has become one of the few entertainment groups using commercial success to support social change. Their charity work spans housing initiatives, disaster relief, and sustainability. They've donated materials to rebuild communities hit by wildfires, partnered with Habitat for Humanity, and funded scholarships for design students from underprivileged backgrounds. For Drew, philanthropy wasn't image management, it was repayment for opportunity. "We were lucky," he said once, and luck means nothing unless you pass it forward. But perhaps the most profound part of Drew Scott's legacy lies in how he handled his own vulnerability. In an era where public breakdowns are tabloid sport, he turned pain into transparency. When his brother JD fell ill, Drew didn't hide behind PR lines. He spoke openly about fear, burnout, and the toll of living on display. That honesty rippled through his fan base. Thousands wrote to say his words gave them permission to rest, to seek help, to stop pretending. It's rare for a man in the public eye, especially one branded as endlessly cheerful, to admit fragility. But that's precisely what makes his story powerful. His tragedy didn't destroy his reputation, it deepened it. It made his triumphs believable, his kindness credible, his fame sustainable. Today, as new faces rise and trends shift, Drew's imprint remains quietly permanent. He's become a template for longevity and entertainment proof that reinvention and integrity can coexist. His journey from child entrepreneur to global television icon has become a modern parable of endurance, adaptability, and grace under pressure. And still, the man himself seems uninterested in myth-making. When asked recently about his legacy, Drew simply said, "I hope people remember that I built things that mattered: homes, yes, but also happiness." That humility is his final signature. Because unlike most television stars, Drew Scott's real masterpiece was never a house or a brand or even a franchise. It was the culture of compassion he left behind. There's something rare about Drew Scott's story, not because it's free from pain, but because it embraces it. In an industry obsessed with reinvention, where fame is currency and exhaustion is disguised as success, Drew represents something almost radical balance. His tragedy wasn't a scandal or a fall from grace. It was the quiet erosion of self beneath the constant hum of achievement. And in rebuilding from that, he became something more enduring than a celebrity. He became a lesson. At Celebrity Forgotten, we often explore the broken edges of fame, the parts of a story that never make the highlight reels. Drew Scott's journey belongs among them, not because he lost everything, but because he almost did and chose peace instead of collapse. It's the kind of heartbreak that hides behind success, the slow suffocation of a life lived for cameras, the invisible burnout beneath every smile. For years he played the role perfectly charming, tireless, unshakable. But when his family's health crisis struck, that perfection cracked, and what emerged from those cracks was truth. That truth makes Drew's story so hauntingly human. He learned through exhaustion and fear that fame can't fill silence, that work can't replace presence, and that even builders must stop to rest. His decision to step back to reprioritize love and fatherhood wasn't just a personal choice, it was a rebellion against a culture that worships overwork. Few stars have the courage to say enough while the applause is still loud, and yet it's impossible to ignore the brilliance of what he achieved. Together with Jonathan Drew, helped redefine what television could do. They built a universe of empathy in an industry addicted to spectacle. Property Brothers wasn't just a renovation show, it was a map of transformation, showing that broken things, homes, people, relationships could be made whole again. That's why his story resonates so deeply. It mirrors the emotional architecture of all our lives, the rise, the burnout, the rebuild. If you strip away the spotlight, Drew's character stands as his most powerful legacy. The boy who once knocked on doors to sell hangers never stopped knocking, only now it's on the doors of millions who needed a reason to believe that change was still possible. His humility, once mistaken for performance, turned out to be his truest form of strength. Of course, no legacy is spotless. Some critics accuse the Property Brothers franchise of over-polish, of turning emotion into formula. Others claim the brothers have become too commercial, too omnipresent. Maybe those critiques hold a kernel of truth, but perhaps that's the price of turning passion into enterprise. You risk being consumed by your own creation. What matters is how Drew responded to it, not with defensiveness, but reflection. He listened, adapted, and redirected his energy toward projects that aligned with his values. Not many can say the same, and that is where his story becomes more than celebrity gossip. It becomes an allegory. We all build facades, we all chase validation, and sooner or later, we all face the collapse. Drew's tragedy reminds us that the collapse isn't failure, it's invitation, the kind that asks, what's left when the performance ends? For Drew Scott, what remained was love for his family, his craft, and his audience. That love rebuilt him in a way no TV comeback ever could. So what's our verdict? His life may not have followed the arc of traditional Hollywood tragedy, but it carries the same emotional gravity, a story of reinvention through pain, of rediscovering purpose beyond fame. In a world obsessed with constant renovation, Drew Scott did the bravest thing imaginable. He rebuilt himself. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden behind all the glitter and camera angles, that the homes we renovate matter far less than the hearts we restore. Some stories don't end with applause. They fade softly, like light leaking through the windows of a quiet home, the kind Drew Scott might have built. His story, after all, was never really about fame. It was about the slow architecture of a life, the rise, the crumble, and the rebuild. There's something cinematic in the way time has reshaped him. Once Drew was the restless dreamer chasing sets, deals, and deadlines as if he could outpace mortality. Now, he moves slower but with purpose. The same hands that once waved in front of millions now lift his son from the floor or brush dust off a half-finished project in his backyard workshop. The cameras still follow, but the performance is gone. What's left is something far rarer than stardom peace. He still appears on screens, of course. The suits are still pressed, the laughter still familiar. But if you look closely, in the quiet glances between him and Jonathan, or the way his voice softens when he mentions Linda or Parker, you'll see a man who has already won the only prize that matters. He's living proof that even the busiest life can find its still point, that even the builders need to rest inside the walls they've created. There's nostalgia in watching him now. We remember the young, ambitious realtor, all charm and confidence, standing in half-demolished homes, promising families that everything broken could be made beautiful again. We didn't realize he was also talking to himself. That's the haunting beauty of Drew Scott's story. It was always a metaphor. Every home he rebuilt was a rehearsal for his own healing, and maybe that's why his legacy feels so intimate. Because beneath the celebrity, beneath the global empire, and the smiling interviews, there's still that boy from Vancouver, the one who sold hangers door to door, who listened to his father's stories under open skies, who learned that purpose was worth more than spotlight. When people look back on Drew Scott decades from now, they may remember the show, the houses, the empire. But those who look closer will see the quiet tragedy, the invisible battle that almost undid him, and the astonishing grace with which he built himself back. His story is not finished, but maybe that's the point. Some lives aren't meant to close neatly, they're meant to echo, and as that echo fades into the hum of a new day, we're left with the haunting thought that lingers at the end of every great story. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know.